5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to the Father Jim Clark Show, here on Heaven's Road FM. Keep tuning in and keep the faith.
Well, welcome back to the show. And I'm very delighted today to have guests with me. And I have two guests from CAFOD, but specifically CAFOD working here in the Salford Diocese. And they work under the umbrella of Caritas Diocese of Salford, which is our, if you like, it's the umbrella charity of the diocese. So I'd like to now introduce you to Jed. Perhaps Jed, if you could introduce yourself, and Elaine as well.
Okay, I'm Jed Edwards. I'm the manager for CAFOD Salford.
Hi, I'm Aline Yasmin, and I'm the communication officer for CAFOD in the Salford Diocese.
So you're doing a bit of the work that I'm doing, Aileen.
Yeah, quite close.
Well, you're very welcome. So what I'd like to do today is really to promote the work of CAFOD. So perhaps, Jed, you might just introduce CAFOD, tell us what it stands for, and the kind of ethos that is behind the work of CAFOD and what it does.
Okay. It stands for Catholic Agency for Overseas Development, and since 1960-62, in fact, it's been supporting the work of the Church as its official overseas agency, promoting development in the world, particularly in the global South, as we call it. And the key thing is to try to enable people there to build a sustainable future for themselves, normally in relationship with its local church or agencies.
Right, that's interesting. You know, it's that old adage about, you know, you give a man a fish and he feeds his family for a day, but if you teach him to fish, then he can feed them for all the time. So that seems to be what you're saying about the work of CAFOD. They try and promote that kind of...
I mean, that's, as in a development agency, that's what we are. But of course, there are times when we're just having to respond to emergencies. So a good example of that recently was the Philippines typhoon appeal, if you remember.
Yeah, indeed.
And the Bishop actually went out to see the results of CAFOD's work immediately after the disaster. And people in Salford Diocese raised, I think it's £235,000.
And that was very quick, wasn't it? I remember, yeah. Because I know that our new Bishop, John Arnold, he is a very strong supporter of the work of CAFOD. Yeah, so that's superb, that.
Yeah.
So as far as the work in Salford then goes, obviously you've talked about CAFOD globally. What about, the local area of Salford and the diocese that we live in? What kind of work do you find yourself doing?
Well, it's raising awareness, particularly of CAFOD's work. That's part of the reason why we're here today, of course. But in addition to that, it's enabling people to ground their own action for CAFOD in the life of the Scriptures, in the life of the Church. So it's getting people to reflect on, in light of the Gospels and social teaching, why it is that they're able and interested and committed to doing something for people who are living overseas and want the support that we can offer them. So that's the praying part of CAFOD's about. There's obviously fundraising, because without the funds we can't do that work.
Yeah.
But the other bit that's particularly come into CAFOD's life since the 1980s has been trying to change the structures which make all those difficult things changeable in the world. So if you remember back to the year 2000 or so, there was a campaign going on to abolish third world debt, and CAFOD was part of that. Now, I remember reading at the time of my interview a couple of years ago for the job that there was... it would have taken 350 years or so to raise the money that would have been needed to abolish third world debt, but campaigning achieved that in 10 years.
Wow.
So it's obviously CAFOD not on its own, but I was acting in partnership with others. So it's really important to combine those three things: raising awareness so people know what's going on, helping people to pray and reflect and to act in a way which is what God would want of us. It's where our faith comes from. We want a faith which is where people can live a life to the full. That's what John's Gospel says, and that's what we want for everybody.
How do you find, I mean, you've spoken there about, a particular crisis and how quickly money is able to be raised. But what about the involvement of people? How do you find people respond to you, say, for, I don't know, voluntary work or getting involved in? Obviously you need hands out there to reach out into the parishes. How do you find people respond to the call of CAFOD?
Very positively. I mean, CAFOD has a good reputation, so people like to support its work. I think it's also an organisation that thrives on volunteers. In our diocese, we've got something like 185 people volunteering for CAFOD Salford, and they do a variety of different things. So some might be acting inside a parish to promote the work, typically around what we call fast days, so that's in Lent and in harvest. And other people will be giving talks, so either around at that time, typically in parishes, or in schools. We'll go into schools and give talks to children, enable them to engage in development issues.
Right.
It's part of the curriculum. And those things are not just for teachers, of course. They're people. We've got people who are plumbers, we've got people who are teachers, of course, but a whole range of people who bring a wide range of life skills to bear there. And then we've got people who do media work, like Aline does here. We've got people who also do admin work for us, and campaigning and fundraising. So people will be running for CAFOD in the 10K in Manchester, or the Pennine Lancashire.
I know I've got members of my parish doing that.
Exactly. So I mean, that's such a positive thing that people can do what they can do. So that's the main.
So perhaps I could just switch over to Aileen. Aileen, you know, you talk about being the communications person for the diocesan CAFOD campaign. Just fill us in a little bit more about the kind of work that you find yourself doing.
Well, a lot of the time it's really putting out there those stories that Jed summarised just now about people's efforts to raise awareness, to fundraise, because we do rely a lot on the work of volunteers, but also on the work of all our supporters, our parishioners, the school children. They come up with some very good, sometimes some very innovative ideas on how to raise money. And a lot of these stories do strike a chord with the local community. So you need to be that's what I do, the bridge between the people who are making these efforts and then the media, so that they can put the word out there and perhaps encourage more people to support us.
Right, well, you brought up a very interesting one for me there with the media. How do the media, I mean the secular media, how do they relate specifically to something as Catholic as CAFOD?
I think the good thing about CAFOD, one of the many good things, but in terms of what you're asking in the secular media, is that CAFOD does reach out beyond, faith. It's not just aimed, for example, at disasters in Catholic countries. It does have a very international mission beyond religion. So this is why it can be of interest to so many people. I know, for example, that a Bolton community raised a lot of money for a water project in Ethiopia, and a lot of the people that helped them in this project, that helped them raise money, were not from the parish, were not from the Catholic community. Right. So it's also that ripple effect, which is nice to see.
Well, I'm kind of delighted that you're both here, really, because one of the things that I've done in many of my shows, I have this kind of almost anti-media thing, really, because the media loves to give the Catholic Church a proper kicking. Whenever they can, they love it. And so it's nice, I think, to get people like yourselves in who, I mean, people know about CAFOD. I think most Catholics would have heard of CAFOD, and maybe a lot of them would know the work that CAFOD is doing. But sometimes people don't realise that CAFOD is not out there in Africa. It's with people like you here in the diocese and in all our dioceses. There are people working to sustain the kind of work that CAFOD does in reaching out to people across the world. And I have this thing, and as I said, I've mentioned it in many of my shows, about trying to explain and try to educate people that, the world is not a bad place, and it's full of good people doing really good things like yourselves.
That's right.
And it's one of the things that I've really tried to, people are probably sick of listening to it, but I do think that, to take on board full-time work for somebody like CAFOD, takes a lot of courage, a lot of, you have to look inside yourself at your own faith standpoint and think, okay, this is a huge thing that's going on from the Catholic Church with CAFOD. What am I able to bring to it? So you mentioned, Jed, I asked you just before we started how long you'd worked for CAFOD. You said just over 2 years. I'm interested in really, when you were going for the interview, what was in your mind? What did you think they were going to ask you? And B, can you answer that question? What did you think about what can I offer to this great institution of the Catholic Church?
At the time, I was just leaving a job or would have left a job in an environmental sector. So climate change is something that's really important to me.
Right.
And it was a job that really involved working with volunteers. We'd had something like 100 volunteers active for us in Chester in the previous year. And I'm a strong believer in the fact that people taking not so much the responsibility but responding themselves to really what they see around them, and if they're guided by their own lights and wanting to make a better future for themselves as well as for other people, then it's about providing them with the opportunity and the encouragement to do that. So to me, CAFOD just fitted in with that really, really well. I mean, obviously I'm from a faith background myself, so that obviously helps. But essentially it's for all people who want to see a better future. I mean, faith is not necessarily a set of doctrines that people want to hold on to. It's about seeing a better world in your mind and putting your efforts and your skills to good use to make sure that happens as best you can.
You see, what I do is when I try and be cold about this and I look at the Catholic Church from outside looking in, it's very easy to see lots of old men parading into maybe into the Vatican, and it can look like an institution from way back when that really needs to get itself together. And I heard somewhere, I don't know whether this is true, but I do keep quoting it because it was quoted on the radio, on national radio, that if you put all the other charities together, all of them, they are not doing as much as the Catholic Church is doing in the world. People don't know that. And this is one of the things that I really like to push. Because, the work that we're doing in the Catholic Church, reaching out to the poor, is amazing. It is not something from way back when. This is modern, we are up to date, and we are really pushing hard.
And I think one of the best examples I can think of with that, Father Jim, is quite simply the work that we do with HIV/AIDS across the world. I mean, most people would associate HIV/AIDS and with sex and with the church not being very positive about sex and so forth. But in fact, the work that the church does with people with HIV/AIDS, who are often right on the edge of a community, they're really excluded from their own communities, is just second to none. I mean, we do something like 30% of the work as well in the world with HIV/AIDS.
Wow,
and it's just astonishingly good. It really is, and I'm very proud of that. That this community, that this Catholic community, helps to make some of that possible. It's fantastic.
Now, you talked about kind of most of the work happening in the Southern Hemisphere. Are there any areas where CAFOD doesn't reach that perhaps they would like to do?
I think there are always issues. I can remember one of our volunteers, young people, a programme that we all call Step Into the Gap. Carmel came back from her experience in Sierra Leone 2 years ago and said that there was a fantastic work that our partners were doing out there in Kenema, actually, where the Ebola crisis is very strong, or has been recently. And she met some people from a nearby village whose situation was much worse because they didn't have the support of the local partner. And there is so much more to be done, of course, but our response to that is either to say, well, we won't bother doing any of it, or we just try to do a bit more. But the reality is, it's a story I often think of, is of two guys walking along a beach, and the sea has thrown a lot of starfish up, and one guy starts to throw starfish back in the sea, And he said, there's no point in doing that, mate. There's thousands of them. He said, it won't make any difference at all. And the first